There is a quiet territory inside every person, a landscape so rarely visited that many of us live entire lives without ever walking its soil. It is not hidden because it is distant, it is hidden because we avert our gaze from it. These are the parts of the self that we are afraid to admit exist, the old emotional machinery we constructed before we knew language, the impulses we have been trained to call unacceptable, the longings we learned to mute, and the shadows we turned away from because looking at them felt dangerous to our sense of worth. When people speak about knowing themselves, they usually mean understanding their preferences, their aspirations, their personality traits. But the deeper layers of the self are far less predictable. They move with animal logic. They carry the emotional fingerprints of childhood. They hold stories we never consciously authored, but have been performing for decades. To understand these parts is not an act of confession, nor is it a heroic confrontation. It is more like sitting beside a shy animal that has been hiding in the dark and learning through stillness that it has been trying to speak for years. These hidden regions of the psyche do not want to be punished. They want to be acknowledged. They want a seat at the table. Yet most of us grew up in environments that taught us to exile them. We learned to be polite instead of honest, accommodating instead of expressive, harmless instead of whole. Over time, this social training creates a split, and we present to the world a curated version of ourselves, something friendly, predictable, and easy to digest. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, entire emotional continents continued to shift, collide, and reshape who we are from underneath. If we watch children carefully, we can see where these early exiles begin. A child who expresses anger too loudly might be told to calm down. A child who shows sadness might be instructed to toughen up. A child who needs attention may be accused of being dramatic. And slowly, in order to belong, the child develops a map of what parts are safe to show and what parts must be hidden. This map rarely gets updated as we grow. The child inside us believes the world still responds the same way. So we adapt. We swallow our anger, numb our sadness, deny our jealousy, mask our longing, and disguise our vulnerability. We build an identity that requires these parts to remain underground. But nothing inside the human psyche disappears simply because it is silenced. What is buried becomes shadow. It does not vanish, it finds new routes. Repressed anger becomes self-blame. Repressed longing becomes attachment anxiety. Repressed sadness becomes exhaustion. Repressed desire becomes shame. And the shadow begins to animate our choices without our consent. It chooses our partners, our reactions, our defenses, our conflicts, and even the situations we repeatedly fall into. The shadow is not the villain, it is the wounded narrator of our lives. But because we refuse to hear its voice directly, it often speaks through distortion. Many people believe the parts they are afraid of are monstrous, but the truth is usually softer and more tragic. What we fear is rarely cruelty or chaos. What we fear is the intensity of our own unmet needs. A need for affection that was once ignored can feel dangerous, as if longing itself could swallow us whole. A need for boundaries can feel terrifying when we were raised to be agreeable at all costs. A need for validation can feel shameful if we were taught that wanting to be seen is embarrassing. These needs, when exiled, take on the shape of shadows. They haunt us not because they are ugly, but because they were once punished. And so we grow afraid of our own tenderness, our own hunger for connection, our own wish to be known. Relationships are the mirrors that reveal these hidden parts. When we fall in love, especially when a bond becomes emotionally significant, the shadow becomes active. Suddenly, we become jealous without wanting to be, insecure without reason, reactive in ways we do not understand. Something in us feels both exposed and threatened. The relationship becomes a stage where our unprocessed past reenacts itself. Someone not replying fast enough awakens the abandoned child. Someone expressing disappointment awakens the shamed child.
Someone asking for space awakens the rejected child. These emotional reactions do not belong to the present, yet they erupt as if the moment were life or death, because to a younger part of us, it still is. Most people assume they are reacting to the other person's behavior. But if we look closely, the intensity is rarely about the present moment. It is about an earlier wound being touched. The partner becomes a symbol, a stand-in for the figure who taught us which parts of ourselves were unacceptable. The shadow recognizes the familiar pattern and tries to rewrite the story with the same tools it had in childhood. If the old wound was abandonment, the shadow clings. If the wound was criticism, the shadow performs perfection. If the wound was unpredictability, the shadow tries to control. The adult self observes these behaviors with confusion, asking why a rational situation triggers such disproportionate emotion. But the answer is simple. An old script has come alive.
These scripts are not written with words, but with expectations. They dictate how we assume others will treat us. They shape what we think we deserve. And because the shadow follows emotional memory rather than logic, we often replay the same patterns across years and relationships without ever realizing we are the common thread. This is the quiet tragedy of the parts we refuse to admit exist. They never stop trying to be acknowledged, and so they return again and again through the only language they know, emotional repetition. We avoid facing these parts not because they are evil, but because they demand honesty. They ask us to accept that we are not the perfectly controlled, endlessly generous, always composed person we pretend to be. They ask us to sit with the idea that we are messy, needy, contradictory, and human. To embrace the shadow is to accept that being fully alive comes with desires that are inconvenient, feelings that are vulnerable, and truths that cannot be smoothed over with politeness. This level of self-acceptance feels dangerous because it strips away the illusions that kept us safe in childhood. Many people would rather maintain the illusion of stability than risk the destabilization of the truth. Yet the cost of avoidance is high. When we refuse to meet these parts, we lose our depth. We lose the ability to understand the forces that guide us. We lose intimacy with ourselves. And this loss bleeds into our relationships, our goals, our mental health. People often wonder why they feel empty, why their achievements do not satisfy them, why their relationships feel repetitive, why they feel like outsiders in their own lives. The answer is rarely external. It is the numbing effect of disowning too much of oneself. To meet these hidden parts requires slowness. It requires a willingness to sit with discomfort. It requires curiosity, not judgment. Imagine walking into a dimly lit room after years of keeping the door locked. Inside, you find fragments of yourself you had forgotten. A small figure curled in the corner who still believes they are too much. A younger version of you still waiting for permission to speak. A fiery creature representing the anger you were never allowed to express. A quiet figure holding the sadness you were taught to hide. None of them look like monsters. They look like children who were left waiting, and they have been waiting for you. This internal reunion does not happen all at once. It is not a dramatic moment of realization. It happens through a series of subtle recognitions. You notice your anger rising, and instead of suppressing it, you ask what it is trying to protect. You feel jealousy, and instead of shaming yourself, you explore the insecurity beneath it. You feel the impulse to please someone, and you pause long enough to ask whether the cost is your autonomy. You begin to see your reactions not as flaws, but as messengers carrying stories about the past. And slowly, the shadow softens. It begins to trust you. The fear of admitting these parts comes from the belief that acknowledging them will destroy the version of you that others find acceptable.
But the opposite is true. When you integrate the shadow, you become more grounded, not less. You become more real. The surface self no longer has to carry the entire weight of your identity, and the hidden self no longer needs to sabotage situations to get attention. You begin to move through life with a sense of internal cohesion. Your relationships become less reactive. Your choices become more aligned with your emotional truth. You stop performing and start existing. To admit the shadow is not to dramatize your wounds. It is to recognize your humanity. The parts you are afraid of are not evidence of failure. They are evidence that you survived by adopting. Every coping mechanism you created once served a purpose. Every defensive behavior was a form of self-protection. The goal is not to erase these parts, but to bring them into awareness so they can evolve with you instead of pulling you backward. When people finally confront these hidden regions, what they discover is not darkness, but tenderness. They find that their deepest fears are rooted in a longing to be accepted without conditions. They find that the anger they tried to suppress was actually a boundary trying to form. They found that their jealousy was a plea for reassurance. They found that their numbness was exhaustion from years of emotional labor. They found that their self-judgment was inherited, not chosen. And they find, often to their surprise, that once these parts are heard, they become calmer. The journey toward meeting the parts of you that you fear is not glamorous. It will not make your life instantly peaceful, but it will make it real. It will give you access to inner dimensions that remain unavailable to those who only polish the surface. You begin to see that your complexity is not a problem, but a landscape worth exploring. You begin to understand that the goal is not purity, but integration. And when you integrate these hidden parts, you stop being a fragmented version of yourself. You become whole. The shadow does not require perfection. It requires presence. It requires patience. It requires a willingness to sit in the dim light and say quietly, I'm listening. And in that moment, the parts you once feared begin to step toward you, not as threats, but as long-lost companions. They are not here to destroy you. They are here to return you to yourself. And that return, slow as it may be, is the beginning of a life lived with clarity, depth, and the unshakable sense that nothing inside you is too frightening to face.